Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, marimuliwanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you join us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show. And please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Rehka Rajan. She is here to celebrate the Read Aloud Factor. Hey, Rehka, how are you?
I am doing so well, Jed. I'm so excited to speak to you. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well, too, but I feel a little bit bad because in my excitement to introduce you, I didn't introduce you properly. It's Dr. Rehka.
Well, here's the thing with the doctor titles, and it's always a point of contention in my family because my brother's a surgeon, so he can save people's lives, and my doctorate is in music education from Columbia, and I can sing to you and make you feel better or tell you why music is so important. But yes, it is a doctorate and just as respected and valuable, but no worries.
Well, I think it's really important. And I have a feeling you've saved a few lives with your music and training people in music. And also, I think you're going to make a huge difference in folks' lives with the Read Aloud Factor. Can you give us the big elevator pitch? Tell us a little bit about the book before we get into it.
Yeah, I mean, I hope this does have an impact. It's really what it started out was there was two wonderful ladies, Carolyn Blakemore and Barbara Ramirez, who have been reading specialists for decades. And they wrote a book, I can't remember who the publisher was or if it was self-published, called Every Word Counts. And it did very well in this very small market, again, maybe 20 years ago. And my agent approached me and said, you have, over 20 years of background in early childhood education, in education, and arts education. I've been a professor, I've been a classroom teacher, and also now a children's book writer, multiple children's books that have been published. She said, would you be interested in just kind of revising this book? And I looked at it and I said, yeah, and this was actually several years ago. And I kept coming back to it and looking at what their narrative and their arc was. Again, they're reading specialists. And what I loved the most was that they gave a lot of strategies and tips. It was a very practical book, also, very heavily based in research. But they really, through the research, created these stages of reading aloud. And so this is how the project started. And it's all in the acknowledgments and in my author's note. But what I found was, after reading their original work, so much had changed. I mean, even in the way that we think about using technology with reading aloud, some of their chapters were, TV is bad and technology is bad and phones are bad and we don't use that for reading, but you can have Alexa read aloud to your child now. And that has been found in research to be just as valuable as a parent or a sibling reading aloud. So what started as what was supposed to be a revision of a wonderful project completely ended up being revamped. I coincidentally, over the several years of working on this, had my own research, a wonderful collaborative project with Rush University. My husband does Alzheimer's research, and I was able to access data and work with them. And that's really the heart of what this book is about, that, yes, there's so many books about reading aloud out there, the joy of reading. We know reading is important, but this is really new research that shows that the more frequently you read aloud to your children at a young age, it has the potential to change the shape of the brain over 60, 70 years. And I think with the MRI data, that makes this book stand out amongst everything else in the field, and you just can't ignore it.
And that's something that's so fascinating to me. And when I started listening to the Read Aloud Factor, I'm not through it yet, but it reinforced information that I've read through in other books, that reading actually changes our brains physically.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't have the MRI data show it. So we were really excited to find that. And it wasn't just the act of reading aloud, like on page 13 of the book, and I have it here because if people want to listen and reference it, we asked, this was observational data. So these participants, several 100,000 participants just for this particular study reflected on several questions we asked. Things like, how often did someone read to you every day? How frequently? How often did someone tell you stories in your house as a child? How often did someone play games with you? And so all of those definitely showed some influence, but the biggest one was how frequently you were read aloud to. And that frequency piece, I think, is key, because the argument I make in the book is that we need to really support and sustain a daily reading habit. And that's what the research supports as well.
Any idea, in my simple little brain here, I'm thinking, the more we read to our kids, the more information goes in there. So the brain has to grow because it doesn't all fit, which is absolutely ridiculous. But I'm just wondering, do we have any idea why a brain will grow? Because it's physically grow, because it's being read to?
So the brain has so many different compartments, right? And the two areas that we found were that the brain shows increased volume and increased cortical thickness. And so if you think about your brain as a sphere, right? You're imagining you're holding like a sphere in your hand. The brain volume is what's inside. So there's a specific part of what's going on inside the sphere that's growing because of the language, the linguistic ability, the auditory components, all of that. But then the cortical thickness is the outside. So you have two different parts of your brain that are actually benefiting from reading aloud, what's going on inside, but then the level of the thickness of your brain, which is really incredible, because if we think about a lot of research, even in music, which is the heart of all of the research I've done, there's different areas and auditory processes and parts of your brain that are activated during musical experiences, during playing, listening. But it's really interesting to see that being read aloud to as a child really has a big influence on both the inside of the brain, right? The volume, and then also the thickness. I can't speak to, it's not a causal study, right? We didn't say XYZ factors, but I think it's enough to show that there is value to this more than people just saying read and go read a book. This is over 60 years. And I think that can't be ignored.
Yeah, well, I think it's just one more piece of evidence, if anybody needed evidence, that there is tremendous value in reading with our kids every single day, 20 minutes a day.
Yeah.
It's so important. And we know that, a kid who is read to every day before they start preschool or kindergarten or first grade, when they arrive at school on that first day, they will have heard over 800,000 more words than their peers who weren't read to. And that's an advantage that won't go away. It's just not something that someone can take away from your kids.
Yeah, and I think it's actually over 1 million words. And, I tell a lot of anecdotal things in the book as well, because I have 3 children, and each of their reading experiences were very different. And each of their language and linguistic abilities were very different. And I can speak to that as well, because, it's not to say that you read aloud every day, your kid's going to become a genius. That's not what this is about. It's about helping them become citizens, proper citizens in their community, understand, how to communicate with one another. It fosters social emotional health, to develop empathy for those who are different or even similar to them. There's so much that comes out of the experience of reading, and the bonding, with your family or with your siblings or friends or grandparents. My experience growing up with reading aloud, we were always in the public library. My mother loved books, still loves books. She would always have a book in her hand. She's what a colleague of mine, the great Ellen Boyko, who was a past president of Scholastic Book Fairs and was generous enough to put an endorsement in for this book. He coined the term super readers, people that just read so much they're constantly reading. That was my mom. She would just read so much. And if I asked her sometimes about a book, she wouldn't even remember. It's just the act of reading was something she just loved so much. But our nightly experience was my brother and I with her in the middle, was to listen to her read a Berenstain Bears book. And it really shaped my childhood. That's one of the biggest things I remember. And then also spending hours in the library, right? With the books on tape, the wonderful things from the 70s and 80s and the plastic bags. And, you know, we love that. I think listening to those books on tapes were what started my voiceover and acting career because I wanted to make my own. And I had my little tape recorder and I record my own. And I'd say, when you hear the ding, you have to turn the page. And I'd force my brother to listen to them. And, you know, we've had so many things from the library and, you know, so many overdue fines. And it's so funny because we would drive at 11:59 p.m. to drop that video off at Blockbuster so we didn't have to pay a fine. We had like $80 in library fees. So there's something to be said about the power of books. We just kept them even if, you know, we had the fines. But it's that experience. That's my childhood, is just remembering that moment with my mom and my brother and being read to. There's so much happening there, not just the brain activity, but the bonding, the social component. It's really special.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about. And I was going, when you mentioned that having Alexa read to your kids is very beneficial too, and we'll get to that in a minute. When you said that, my first reaction was, no, it's not. It's the bonding, and that's why I started the Reading with Your Kids podcast, to get closer to kids. But I'm actually happy that there's some evidence that having a kid listen to a book being read by Alexa or Siri or a book on tape, that there's value to that. And it helps because one of the things that if there is something I'm frustrated about doing the Reading with Your Kids podcast, is that I know that I'm kind of preaching to the choir. Most of the people who are listening to this are people who love books, who love reading with their kids, and I don't have to convince them to do that. But, you know, when I mentioned that a kid who's been read to arrives at school with, you know, having heard over 800,000 or a million more words than their peers, I want to close that gap. I want to find a way that we as a community that have come together through this podcast can work together so that we're not going to close the gap by stopping reading to our kids, but we're going to close the gap by somehow encouraging and supporting the families out there that aren't able to read with their kids for a myriad of reasons, most of them out of their control. And so can we talk a little bit about that? Talk first about that research that shows that technology can be a substitute.
Yeah, I think there's multiple pieces to this. If we think about, you know, you can't be on an iPad or you can't watch TV, and my kids are all on iPads all day in school. It's just the way education has shifted, and we have to acknowledge that as parents. And as we acknowledge that, you know, I've been the mom that gives my phone when my 2-year-old was in the stroller, or, you know, put an iPad so that they could eat. I've done that. And yes, a lot of parents have to do that. And there's a lot of research in early childhood education that shows in the first 5 years of life, parents are really just in survival mode and not enrichment mode. And some of these things are thought of as enrichment. I have to quickly add that a pediatrician, my children's pediatrician, is also mine, is a lovely gentleman, and he has grandkids. And so I brought him these books, and I brought him the Read Aloud Factor, and I signed the children's books for his grandkids. And then he said, sign this one to me. And I got all choked up. And he said, because as a pediatrician, this is what I recommend you do from pregnancy, from birth. It is now a recommendation by pediatricians across the country that you read aloud to create a healthy lifestyle for your child. Think about the power of that. That reading is just as important as how much screen time, what types of food you eat, how much physical activity. And I think that speaks to helping families understand it's not just a fun pastime. It's actually critical to your children's health and development. With the technology piece, I feel like Alexa and these wonderful ebooks, my kids would read Curious George on their iPad. There's music, there's interactive pieces. And that kind of amplifies the reading experience. To me, it's just an elevated, more technologically savvy version of the books on tape that we would listen to. So if my mom couldn't, you know, read to us, we were still hearing our, you know, books read to us. We're hearing our native language. We're hearing the fluency. And that all helps with reading fluency and language development. I have a board book series called This Is Music. And I was very fortunate that the publisher, Penguin Random House, let me do the audiobooks, and my kiddos all brought instruments into the studio, and we created an interactive listening game at the end of the audiobook so that not only are children listening to the story, hearing instrumentation throughout the book, but we created a listening game where there's a sound that they hear, and then they have to decide if it's a drum or not. Mm-hmm. And as adults, we assume everybody knows what a drum is, but really those are learned skills to learn what is a stringed instrument, what's a horn instrument. It's the same with reading. You can't understand the fluency of your language, the intonations, the pitch, unless you hear it. And I think that's what's the center of reading aloud and the importance of it, but also where technology can come into play if you don't have the ability or time to read to your child.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is really exciting because one of the things that I asked my beautiful wife and her best friend when we first launched the show, both of them were educators here in the Boston public school system. And I said, how can we get the parents of your kids, inner city parents, how can we get them to listen to the podcast and read with their kids more? And they said, Jen, our parents, a lot of them can't read.
Exactly.
And that blew my mind. And then I saw that there's a third of Americans that are considered, I don't know what the correct term is, but they're not competent readers. They don't have the confidence. They're not illiterate, but they're not confident. They're not able to sit down and confidently read with their kids.
The other piece I have to add quickly is that our families in our communities are all multilingual, many of them, and multi-generational. And a grandmother who's perhaps taking care of a grandchild might not be able to read fluently in English, but could in Spanish. And so there's just a lot of components to that. So there's just, even though we want to kind of shun away from technology and hold the physical book and read it, I think that's always the best thing to do. That'll always be the recommendation. My mom was reading on Kindle and she reads on her iPad. I still can't. I still love the experience of holding a book and reading it and smelling the books in the library and those are all things I grew up with. But we have to recognize the needs of our families and changing communities. And I think technology is a key piece there.
Yeah. And that was one of the other issues. A lot of the parents don't speak English. They don't read in English. A lot of families are working 2 or 3 jobs. And by the time they get home and trying to cook, they're exhausted. They don't have the time. So how do you think we, as members of this Reading with Your Kids community, and this is actually the first time I've ever referred to this as a community, but we are a community, we've come together. How can we go out and spread this word? How can we go to our PTO meetings and say, hey, look, obviously get Read Aloud Factor and read about this, but also let's find ways to support those families that are finding it difficult to read every day with their kids.
Here's what I would love to encourage if we're going to get the PTO involved is do a field trips to the public library. Help your elementary school children and middle school children and high school children each have a library card and give them the autonomy to choose the books that they want to read. Because research has also showed that children are twice as likely to read books that they choose because they're interested in it. I grew up in a time period where if I brought an Archie comic to school, they said that wouldn't count as reading. But now graphic novels permeate children's literature. And that's something to be acknowledged. I think getting families to know that the public library is not just a place where you can get books. Yes, that is the primary source of it. But through the pandemic, I have seen that it's also a place where now there's all sorts of online, like Overdrive and apps like Sora that families can access to check out books and get books based on children's preferences. There's also so many wonderful family engagement workshops. I've done work with a lot of nonprofits that have also shown that a lot of communities don't know that the library is free. And that's something that we take granted for, or take for granted because it's there. I grew up in it because, we couldn't spend $200 and buy every book we wanted. And not everybody can. And also that's not sustainable if we want to be eco-friendly too. I mean, I want everybody to buy my book, but how many people can afford it, or, how much do we want to think about literacy as just a book in your hand? There's so many, our children, and I look at my own three, are so multifaceted in the way that they experience literacy, that if we can get the PTO to acknowledge that, if we can get communities to really acknowledge that and really partner with the public libraries, I think is the way to start. Help new teachers build their classroom libraries by checking out books from your local librarian. That's what my mom would do. She would leave her lunch hour every day for over 30 years and go to the library and check out 20 books, 30 books for her class. And I think that's where we can start to get families more aware of building a rich literacy habit.
I agree with everything you said. And the reason I'm shaking my head a little dumbfounded, it's like, so why do we have to encourage schools to develop a relationship with their public libraries? I mean, we do. I just don't understand why it wasn't happening naturally.
Jen, I agree. I agree with this. So growing up in Chicago, I always had a school library, right, in my elementary school. And we would have classroom libraries. But we lived in California for 3 years. We moved to Sacramento for about 3.5 years. We've only been back in Chicago a year and a half. My kids were all in elementary school. There were no school libraries. These are public schools. Mm-hmm. Because I'm a big proponent of public schools, just because that's how I grew up, and, tax dollars and all of that. But there were no school libraries and minimal classroom libraries. And so when my kids came back to Chicago and the suburbs that we live in now, and they're like, we have library day, we checked out this book. I'm telling them, yes, this is what your schooling experience should be. This is what John Dewey wrote about. This is what all our educational founders and theorists and philosophers wrote about. Like, school is to help shape our children to be model citizens, right? And good citizens in their community. How can you do that without access to books?
Yeah. Now, I agree. Here in Boston, 44% of the public schools here in Boston, do not have a school library. And I don't understand it. As you're talking about, develop your mom as a teacher had a relationship, went to the library on a regular basis, brought those public library books into her classroom, and encouraging PTOs. I think it would be an awesome day, especially now that everybody's used to Zooming and we don't have to figure out a day for every parent to come in for an open house. If there are any teachers out there, any school librarians out there, I want to challenge you to put together a Zoom night where your parents are invited to come on Zoom, talk to you, and talk to the local public librarian, and let her take her phone around and show everybody all the great things that are in the library, and let them know that this is free. It's a resource. It's yours. You have you're paying for it already. You have the right to use it. So come on in. It's going to make a big difference in your kids' lives.
Get that public library involved, because she is ready. He is ready. They are so engaged and so excited to be. They're again, and I'll share some of these studies with you. We found that libraries became the center of communities during the pandemic. It's where parents who were at home struggling to figure out how to support their children's education, how to augment what 1 hour or 2 hours of Zoom they were doing. If they didn't have an education background, I'm very blessed to have one. So I could pull up different lesson plans. Mm-hmm. I could, create my own projects for children, but not everybody has that background or the time or the experience to do so. The libraries, public libraries, became the center of communities. And I think we need to really help schools and help families and principals and administration recognize that and get a public librarian to talk in your school. Yeah. Just like I do author visits, have a librarian come in and sign up library cards. You know how powerful that is for a child to take home a library card? I think it would be amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And don't worry that the librarian is not going to be open to the idea. They want to help. They are eager to help.
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, you mentioned earlier on your husband has some research towards Alzheimer's disease, and I'm pretty ancient. Any research that, reading with our kids and continuing to read ourselves as we grow and we age is going to have a difference in our abilities and the chances to fend off Alzheimer's and dementia and other kind of neurological issues that are facing?
Oh my goodness. I'll have you invite him to do a whole talk about this because he would love to speak. He's a director of the Rush Institute for Healthy Aging at Rush University in Chicago, and he has a very big group and millions of dollars of research on all of this. He's done a lot of incredible work. He found a test, I believe, this is published in Time magazine, several years ago. I think it's a memory or cognitive test that could help predict the potential of Alzheimer's like 18 years prior to diagnosis, but it's not like what that sounds. It's not like you take a paper pencil test and then, oh gosh, wait for 18 years, it's going to happen. It's very complicated research. And so I don't want to throw out, you do this or that. This is what's going to happen, because all of the research in my book with Reading Aloud is what's considered an observational study. So It's not a cause and effect. We're observing data over a span of many years amongst, thousands of individuals, and we're able to make conclusions, but it's not necessarily going to be the same for every single person. But we see that there's a potential here. We did a wonderful study together that was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. Because of my background in music, I asked him, I said, could we look at something where all of this research around music and Alzheimer's is, and even, reading or art is about what they're doing, right? You're making music, you're playing an instrument, you're doing art. Is there something that we could look at that's, more passive, not to say it's not important, and I hate to even use that word, but that was the word we used at the time. So we looked at how attending live performances can support cognitive health when you're 65 or older. So this is like ballet, musicals, plays, attending a live performance. And again, frequency seems to be a key player here. The more frequently you attend a live performance, musical, play, ballet, any type of dance, theater, it actually slows your cognitive decline.
Ooh.
Which, yeah, so there, and again, and that's published, it's on the NEA website, and it was a wonderful study, because then to show a lot of people, again, for me, with reading, with the arts, there's an access and equity piece. Not everybody can pay $100 for music lessons or afford a $20,000 grand piano. Not everybody can buy every book, children's book you want in a series, so you go to the library and you check them out and keep reading them. That's the access and equity piece to me, and it spans across our lifetime. And even with literacy, it's literary arts. These are all different types of art forms. Again, I'm always telling people as an early childhood teacher, when they're like, why is music important? Well, we teach not just in English, across many different cultures, the alphabet through singing. Mm-hmm. And that's where it starts. And there's so many connections. It's in the book about not just technology, art, and music, and how that's related to literacy, and just collectively, hopefully, creating a really rich, literate environment in your home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've given me a lot to think about. You give me a great excuse to go to more concerts and comedy shows.
Yes, we have to.
Yes. And also, I want to take this opportunity. I'm talking about us as a community going out there and finding ways to support literacy and helping families that aren't reading with their kids every day, and helping them find the tools and the time and the support so they can read with their kids more often. One of the statistics that I saw that was really fascinating is this idea that if you have as few as 20 books in your home, your kid has a much more likely chance to attend university. And for you and I, 20 books in a home, well, it's a couple $100, not a big deal. For a lot of families, it's a huge deal.
It is.
So, we have here at the Reading with Your Kids podcast, we're constantly receiving books, and it's wonderful. And we've been giving a lot of those books away one at a time at different events, again, to people who are going to events about reading because they already love reading. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to change at least the trajectory of one family's life every month in 2023, where instead of giving out one book to one kid, we're going to give out a 30-book library to a family.
Oh, that's fabulous. Well, I'd love to have Amazing Landmarks and the This Is Music series part of that, I will send you copies or talk to the publisher or see what we can do. That's wonderful, Jed. That'll make such an impact.
Well, we want everybody to check that out. We're going to be starting it in January, and I'm just really excited. And I'm really excited that you've been on, Dr. Rehka. Tell everybody where they can go to find out more about the Read Aloud Factor and all of your other books and all about you.
Well, that's really sweet. My website is just my name, RehkaRajan.com. I have my books on there. I have resources for teachers, worksheets for the author visits that I do for Amazing Landmarks, for K through 2 and 3 to 5 that I designed. The This Is Music is a board book series. Drums and horns were published this year, and strings and voice will come next year, and there's an instrument in each book. So there's a little drum in the back of drums, there's a blowhole in horns. Strings is obviously going to have strings to pluck. And as an opera singer, and how many hours I spend standing in front of the mirror, voice has a little mirror for children to see them sing to themselves. And the Read Aloud Factor is published by Chicago Review Press and is on their website. But all these books could be found on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or really your local bookstore too, I'm sure, would have them.
And you can go to the public library and ask them to find it and bring it to the library too.
I secretly like to check all my local public libraries, and when I see that all the copies are checked out, that's what makes me happy. Yes. Please support the public library, and yes, build your school library, classroom libraries. And if I could add one more thing, Jed, I do want to say to anyone who reads this book, anyone who's a parent, anybody who's listening as a teacher, we all know that children develop at their own pace and in different ways. My oldest, who's now 13, did not talk till he was 4.5. And we did all sorts of oral testing, checked with a pediatrician about autism and all sorts of developmental delays. And he was the one we read to the most. And I just want to put that out there because he's our first, right? Mm-hmm. We do everything. We were reading multiple books. I have pictures of everybody, grandparents reading him books, and we couldn't figure out what we did wrong. Like, why wasn't this kid talking at 4? But that's how you feel as a new parent. And I share this in the book because we weren't doing anything wrong. It was genetic. My brother didn't talk till he was 4. One of our cousins didn't either. Like I shared earlier with you, my brother's a surgeon. Nobody can tell now that Juggin at 13 ever had a speech delay. But I do think the consistent reading helped him hear his native language, whether he was ready to speak or not. My daughter was speaking at a year. And by the time I had my third kiddo, we barely read to him. But you know what I did? I had my older 2 read to him. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of what this community is you're talking about, Jed. It's not just one person reading to one child. It's families reading to each other. My daughter will read to our dog, our birds. It's that experience, too, of reading aloud to an animal or to somebody else. And that's the community. It's in our home, but it's also the schools and the partnerships with the libraries that we can really keep showing the power of reading. Yeah.
Well, this has been a really powerful episode, and I want to thank you for being with us. We've had a great time speaking to the author of the Read Aloud Factor, Dr. Rehka Rajan. Hey, Dr. Rehka, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Cheryl Johnson. She's an incredibly successful, traditionally and self-published author. She's going to be sharing some of the wisdom that she has gained through her many years of publishing and writing books. That's the next episode of the podcast. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Chris, I want to start by thanking our guest, Dr. Rehka Rajan. Please be sure to check out the Read Aloud Factor. It's a fascinating read. It's also a fascinating listen. That's what I'm doing. I'm listening to the audio version. It's fantastic. Also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Jordan Saley, Stephanie Gavila, Skylar Stouse. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.